At this point in Matthew's biography of Jesus' life, we're still pretty early into his ministry here in chapter 9. And it's important to remember that, Jesus was a Jewish rabbi. So a rabbi, that means that he was a teacher of the Old Testament scriptures, and he would have had a following of students. So it would be almost like a traveling school. So Jesus was a teacher of the Old Testament scriptures, a rabbi with these students. Of course, the Bible calls them disciples. So these disciples would follow him around. So any rabbi in this time period would have had a very similar teaching ministry. Jesus wasn't the only one. There were lots of rabbis around Palestine at the time. However, Jesus is not your average rabbi. He is teaching differently. When he teaches about the Old Testament, he says things that no other rabbi would dare say, such as, these things I'm telling you are actually about me. Jesus is teaching and telling people that the Old Testament is actually pointing to him, that it's about him. And on top of that, he's performing miracles. He's healing people of their disease. He is performing these miracles when people are in great need. So, of course, as you could imagine, his fame is starting to spread throughout the area. More people are starting to follow him, some even as his full-time students or disciples. But of course, you have a pretty significant contingent of people who are very skeptical of this Jesus rabbi. They're not sure what to think about him yet, and you're going to see that as we come to this story in chapter 9. And what's interesting here is that the author of this book that we're reading, Matthew himself, this is his personal account of his own calling by Rabbi Jesus to become one of his full-time disciples. All right, so let's pick up in verse 9. You can look on the screens with us. If you don't have a Bible with you, that's all right. Just follow along. All right, so Matthew chapter 9, verse 9. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. Now we'll stop right there for just a moment. So we're really not given any details here as to whether Matthew already knew Jesus or knew a lot about him. He probably did, though, because, again, Jesus is performing miracles, word getting around, right? So this scene is happening in the small village of Capernaum on the Sea of Galilee, right? So it's very likely that Matthew already knew a lot about Jesus' ministry, right? Even before viral TikTok videos, he probably heard it somehow the old-fashioned way. But what we really need to point out here is that Matthew was a tax collector for the Roman Empire. Now, that may not mean much to you, but let me tell you, in the first century, that's a big deal. That's a big deal, and here's why. Because first century Jewish tax collectors were hated by their own people. Like, even more than you may hate the IRS, you know what I mean? Like, it was bad. So they were considered absolute traitors. They were considered traitors because they were working for the empire that was oppressing their own people. So essentially, they are funding through their work, right? They're taking people's money, their own people's money, and essentially helping to fund the continued oppression. And most of them would get rich off of this because, you know what? They'd be dishonest. And they would take more money than they actually needed for the taxes, and they would keep the extra for themselves. So, do you understand here that it is unbelievably shocking that Jesus would ask this tax collector who is Jewish but works for the Roman Empire, that he would ask this traitor to be one of his full-time disciples? Now, I can only imagine the other disciples are probably looking at Jesus and seeing what's going on. They would have hated Matthew themselves, right? Peter probably looks at Jesus and says, What are you doing? What? This guy, really? Like, Jesus, are you being audited or something? Like, why do you need this guy to follow you around? You need some help? We can help you, right? But the shock goes to another level. Matthew accepts. He accepts Jesus' invitation. And you know what he does next? This is so cool. I love this. He throws a huge dinner party at his house to celebrate that he's now a disciple of Jesus, right? Maybe have you ever quit a job and thrown a party afterwards because you just hated it, right? Well, that's what Matthew's doing. Look at this, verse 10. And as Jesus reclined at table in the house, so this is in Matthew's house, behold, many, not just a few, but many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. Now you got to remember, right? Matthew, he's probably pretty wealthy, okay? So he's probably got a pretty nice big house, big dining room table. But ironically, he probably doesn't have many friends except other tax collectors and, well, sinners, right? The kinds of people who would want to hang out with those rotten traitors. I just imagine Peter going up, Peter's just easy to pick on, right? I just imagine Peter going up to Jesus before they go inside and hey, Jesus, listen, it's great that you want to help Matthew out and everything, but should we really be going into this house with those people? This is going to hurt our reputation. Can you imagine, Jesus, all the rumors that are going to be flying around Galilee tomorrow if we go in there and have dinner with those people? But I don't know, maybe is that a valid point though? Because in the ancient world, as it is in today's world in many ways, sharing a meal with someone was a sign of friendship. It was a sign of love and acceptance. And so by Jesus sitting at the same table with these tax collectors and sinners, as Matthew calls them, all these people that no one else would dare associate with in society, Jesus sharing a table, sharing a meal with them. And that's a huge statement, which is exactly why this religious group of the time called the Pharisees, they saw this happening. And of course, they have to insert their snide remark. And so here's what they say in verse 11. Look at this. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Like I said, maybe this is a valid question. Why is Jesus eating with these sinners? Now, briefly, if you're not familiar with these Pharisees, they were a small but powerful and very influential and highly educated Jewish religious group in the first century who believed in God, right? And they believed even in the Old Testament. But they did not believe Jesus. They did not believe and accept that he was the Son of God, that he was what the Old Testament was building up to as the coming Messiah. But what they were most famous for was constructing their own laws and rules and regulations in addition to the Old Testament. Now, why would they do that? Why would anybody want more rules and more laws? Well, it helped build their case for their own pride and to showcase their immorality. So they did this so that they could be extra careful that they were clean before God. That's what it was all about. They wanted to prove that they had what it took to be clean and perfect and righteous before God. So they would be super careful with things like washing their hands before dinner, right? And they would be super careful with not eating any kind of food that was considered contaminated or unclean, that would make them unclean before God. But this also meant that they would not associate, much less share a meal at the same table with anyone who would contaminate them spiritually. They thought the sin, if they associated with other sinners or with sinners, with these tax collectors, these traitors, that it would just rub off on them. Like they seriously would not even get close to anyone whose sin was known publicly. So it's no wonder that they are having a complete meltdown when they see a rabbi like Jesus eating with these unclean people. Well, Jesus hears their snide remark, and you know what? He gives them an answer. But his answer tells us a lot about himself and his reason for coming to earth. Look at verses 12 and 13. But when he, Jesus, heard it, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." So, for the rest of our time this morning, I'd like for us to talk about three things, just three things that we can learn from this episode, this short but powerful story. The first thing I think we can learn from this episode is this. Number one, we see here the sickness we must admit. You know, there's really only two types of men when it comes to sickness. There's the kind who actually need to go to the doctor, but are stubborn and refuse. Perhaps you're married to one, right? You know, "Oh, I'll be fine. It's nothing, I'll be fine," right? "Honey, you need to go there." "No, I'm good," right? And then there's the other type, which is the type I am, who are big babies, right? And get the slightest scratch in your throat, and then you start Googling it, and 30 minutes later, I'm planning my own funeral, right? I mean, that's just kind of how the process goes. Get off of Google, people. All right, ChatGPT also. If you're not sure which one you are, everybody else knows, okay? Like, everybody else in your life knows, okay? So just ask anybody. So I think we all, right, I've just never met a level-headed man when it comes to sickness, but whatever, I'm sure you're out there. So I think all of us approach physical sickness differently, right? But Jesus makes an interesting correlation between the words sick and sinner. Look at verse 12 again. He says, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick." Now, what does he mean? Well, he clarifies this in verse 13. At the end of verse 13, he says, "For I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." Do you see there? He is correlating the word, he's sick with sinners. He's saying that sin is a sickness. These are Jesus' words. This is what he's saying, right? But what does that mean? Well, for most of us, right, when we hear the word sin, you know what we think of? We think of just like a bad action, right? So bad actions or behaviors. You know, so of course, you know, there's the big sins like murder or worshiping a false god, right? But there's lots of other bad actions, bad sins, like lying, right? Like telling your kids that all the Reese's, just the Reese's in their Easter basket are poison, right? So you have to confiscate them and they'll never see them again, right? I would never do that. In other words, lying is a sin, even when you're preaching. Sins, right? Sins are the bad things we do, right? But sins are not just, hear me out, sins are not just some bad things that we do occasionally. Right? Sin is not just, oh my goodness, I shouldn't have done that, right? Sin goes far deeper. Sin goes far deeper than that and is a disease. It's a sickness, Jesus says. And it's a sickness the whole human race has been dealing with ever since the first humans rebelled against their Creator. You see, in the beginning, God made a good world. Everything when God created the earth was beautiful, and everything worked and functioned as God designed it to be. And then God created humans in his image to love him and to find their ultimate peace and satisfaction in him. And let's not kid ourselves. He set the stage for us to thrive. God gave the first humans, Adam and Eve, he gave them just a beautiful paradise. Everything that they could ever want, right? But the first humans were not content with that. They wanted to be their own authority. They appreciated God and what he gave them, but they wanted more. It was never enough. And ultimately, they just wanted to answer to themselves. You see, that's what sin is. The Bible calls this rebellious nature inside of all of us towards our Creator to not submit to his authority over our lives, to not love him and find our ultimate peace and satisfaction in him and who he is, and the wonderful beauty of his character and nature, Instead, we want to find that within ourselves or in something else in this world. And so the Bible calls that rebellion sin. And it's this sickness that we have that has contaminated the entire human race. But that's not the worst of it. You see, sin makes us unclean. And if we're unclean, we cannot get a seat at God's table. See, the Pharisees, they were on to something. They at least knew that much. That unclean people with sin, these sinners in Matthew's house, that they do not deserve a seat at the same table with one who is claiming to be the Son of God, God in the flesh. But see, that's true for us. Because of my sin, because of our nature and not wanting to submit fully to God, not wanting to love and worship Him as He designed for us to be, we're unclean. And we can't get a seat at His table. There's no advanced reservation you can make. He is perfectly pure, He is righteous, and we cannot enter His presence in heaven with our sinful sickness and contaminated souls. That's what the Bible teaches us all throughout. So what do we need? We need a doctor, and we need a cure. And that brings us to number 2, the second thing we see from this simple and short story this morning. It's the cure we must accept. So, our sinful sickness makes us unclean, right? And our uncleanness keeps us from getting a seat, so to speak, at the table of God. Which again is exactly why the Pharisees can't wrap their minds around Jesus. They don't understand how He can claim to be God's Son and sit at the same table with these unclean sinners, and even more, call some of them to be His disciples, His followers. You see, the funny thing about the Pharisees is, like I said, they agreed that sin makes you unclean. And they agreed that being unclean would keep us from God's presence forever. So we would agree with them on these points. But the reason that they clashed with Jesus is because they believed the cure to this sin-sick problem was found within themselves. They thought that they could essentially heal themselves. Here's what I mean. These Pharisees, this religious group, they believed that they had to prove themselves. They believed that if they could just be good enough, with their moral behavior and their ethical standards, then God would see their good effort and He would applaud them and approve of them. And you know what? They tried really hard. They are clean. They cleaned themselves up, and He would let them enter into His presence. They believed they could clean themselves up and that they must do this. They must clean themselves up to get God to accept them. But you see, it was a system of self-salvation. It was a system that they constructed. And here's the sobering reality that this story teaches us. Religious and non-religious people, hear me out. Religious and non-religious people today in this world, in this era, are a lot more like the Pharisees than we would ever dare admit. Everyone has a system that they have constructed in their hearts, in their minds, with their lives. Everyone has a system of ethical and moral standards, right? We all do. Right? Even an atheist would have a system that they have constructed that they try to live by. And they live by that and consider themselves a good person. So whatever measurable things they have, that's it. So that's what I mean, religious and non-religious. We all are creating ethical systems and moral standards that we choose to live by. So normally, this is how this goes, right? We pick and we choose beliefs along the way throughout our course of life. Whatever we see work, whatever we think might work, for us, we choose it, we pick it, and we hold on to that and say, this is how I'm gonna live my life, and that's how I'm gonna feel good about myself if I keep up to these standards I've set for myself. So here's what every human does with that. We weigh our good based on the system we've created for ourselves. We weigh our good versus our bad. We do this all the time, right? We love measurements. We're a very measurement-oriented race of people, humanity. We love measuring things all around you. You see measurements everywhere, right? And we do that to ourselves spiritually. At least we try. And if you believe in a God, if you believe in some kind of higher power, higher being, some kind of God, you give him the name that you create, right? Or an afterlife of some kind, then you think you can essentially make up for any bad you've ever done by what? Living according to those standards you've set, which is cleaning yourself up and doing good to make up for the bad. But the Bible teaches us that if this is how we think about life, then we greatly underestimate the gap between us and a perfectly holy God. That is not a gap that we can close. Romans 3:23 tells us this: for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. In other words, God has created a standard, and what the Bible is telling us is that no one is ever going to be good enough. Are you seriously going to measure yourself against a perfectly holy God and think that you can somehow attain up to his level of goodness and moral and ethical standards? So trying to bridge the gap between our sinful sickness and the perfect morality, the perfect goodness and character of God, trying to bridge that gap on our own moral effort is like standing on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean and saying, all right, guys, watch this. I'm about to jump to Africa. I'm just going to do it. Here I go. Ready? 1, 2, 3, right? And if I wouldn't totally embarrass myself, I would show you how far I can jump right now, and it's about 10 inches, all right? But a more realistic analogy would be this, right? So how absurd is this, right? But a more realistic analogy is not whether you can jump across the Atlantic Ocean. It's that sin is a poison in our blood, and your body cannot fight it off. Jeremiah, the prophet of the Old Testament, in chapter 17 of his book, says it this way: the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? See, just the other day, my family, we were watching a nature show on TV, and they were showing how they made these antidotes for poisonous snake bites. You know, just good, wholesome family entertainment that we were watching. But this totally creeps me out. The only thing that me and Indiana Jones have in common is our fear of snakes, right? That's where we draw that line. But it was fascinating. It was fascinating how they made this antidote for the venom. I was just blown away by this. It was incredible. And it got me thinking. Thank God for these antidotes for snake venom, right? I mean, who wouldn't take that? If you got bit by a poisonous rattlesnake somewhere here in Florida, which is possible, right? Who wouldn't take the antidote? You'd be crazy not to. Right? Only someone who was too stubborn or too prideful, who irrationally thinks that they can beat it themselves. And that's exactly what Jesus is saying to these Pharisees, and that's exactly what he's saying to us. Look at verse 12. What does he say? He says, the well, those who are well, they have no need of a physician, but no, those who are sick. For I came not to call the righteous, but the sick, sinners, with the poison of sin that has contaminated their souls. Jesus is saying that He is the physician for those who are sick with sin, but get this, He's not just the doctor. He is the cure. He is the cure Himself with His blood as the antidote. And that's the answer. That's the answer to the Pharisees' question. Hey, why does your teacher eat with those people? Why does your teacher eat with these tax collectors, these traitors, these people who have betrayed us, who have cheated us out of our own money, who have stolen from us and profited from it and oppressed us through their involvement with the empire? Why are you eating with them? Why are you eating with these sinners, these prostitutes, these people who have committed adultery, these people who we know they're lousy? Why are you eating with them? You see, Jesus is a different kind of doctor. He takes our sickness on himself. He injects the poison of sin into himself. And you know what he gives us? In exchange, he gives us himself. He gives us the cure of his righteous blood, perfect and righteous, given to you when you put your faith in what he is doing and not yourself. You know, it's remarkable all throughout Matthew, all throughout this biography of Jesus' life, you know what we see time and time again? We see Jesus approaching the contaminated of the world. But it's remarkable in every single episode what happens. When he approaches these people, instead of them making him unclean, you know what happens? He makes them clean. Now, I'm a little bit of a germaphobe, okay? I can't tell you how many people over the years will shake my hand and then tell me that they have a cold. And I'm like, why would you do that, right? So we're all worried a little bit, right, about being around people who are sick because we think, well, I might get infected. I don't want to get that sickness. But all throughout Matthew, Jesus goes right up to those who are sick, and instead of them infecting him with their sickness, he heals them with his holiness. His holiness in those moments is more powerful than their sickness, physical or spiritual. And no little short episode says this better than the one in Matthew chapter 8. Look at this real quick. Matthew chapter 8. And behold, a leper came to him and knelt before him, saying, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched this man whom, let you understand, it was illegal. It was actually illegal for this man to approach anyone, much less Jesus physically touch him. Yet Jesus touches this poor man who is suffering from this leprosy. And he says what? He says, I will be clean. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. No sickness is any match for the holiness of Christ. And this is what Jesus does. This is what he does time and time again, all the way throughout the Gospel of Matthew. Time and time again, he touches the unclean and they become clean until you get to the end of Matthew. And then Jesus injects himself with our sickness. Do you see the remarkable turnaround? His whole life, his whole ministry, he was touching the unclean and making them clean. He was raising them up. And then at the end, what does he do? He puts all of it in himself. He injects the poison of sin into himself on the cross. That's why Paul says it this way in 2 Corinthians. He says, for our sake, for the sick. He did it for those who were sick, the sick sinners, me and you. He said, for our sake, he made him to be sin who never knew sin. Jesus was perfectly obedient to his Father, perfectly obedient to the scriptures. He never knew sin. Why? But he took it on himself. Why? So that in him we might become the righteousness of God. He injects himself with our sickness and gives us his perfect, clean bill of health instead. He is the cure. By his wounds we are healed. Jesus, the clean, entered this world, our presence, for the sole reason of taking on our uncleanness so that we could receive in exchange, by faith in his name, his clean record credited to our heart, to our account, so that we may enter God's presence, so that you can get a seat at the table. And that brings us to the third and final thing we can see in this story. It's the healing that we can experience. You see, when you take the antidote, when you accept the cure, then and only then will your spiritual sickness be healed. Now, I want to be clear. This does not mean that when you trust Christ to be your Savior, that you will never sin again, right? We're still in our human bodies living in a sinful world, so that's going to be the case. But you know what's different? Now you're on a different road. You're on a different path. When you trust Christ to be your true Savior, when you stop playing the same game that the Pharisees were playing and trying to create your own system of values and live according to those, whether you've been religious or not up until this point in your life, doesn't matter. Whatever system you've created in your head and you're trying to live accordingly, whenever you lay it down and you say, I will never bridge the gap. I will never jump across the ocean to God. I will never climb the mountain to get to Him. He must come down to me. When you realize that and you admit that, see, your standing before God changes. Your position before God changes. And the Holy Spirit of God lives in you to help you fight against sin through His truth in the Bible and with the help of fellow Christ followers. And that is what spiritual healing really looks like. Spiritual healing in our lives, you know what? It can be slow. It can be a slow process. And often it can be a painful process. But through the power of Christ in you, God will shape you into the person that He created you to be. I just want us to imagine what the sinners and tax collectors were thinking when Jesus walked into that room. And when He sat down beside them at the dining room table, I just can imagine these people are thinking, why is He here? Does he not know who we are? Like, why is He here with me? And I just want for you to imagine that you are one of those people sitting there that night. And imagine if Jesus Himself sat down in the chair next to you. And all you can feel, I don't know about you, but this is how I would feel at first. I would feel the weight of my guilt and my shame and my sin. I would feel like with Him being that close to me that I should be hiding something. It just wouldn't seem right at first. I would feel the shame. You would feel the shame of your sin with someone so perfectly righteous and holy beside you. But then the most remarkable thing happens. He starts talking to you. Not in a condescending way, but in a tender, understanding way, and He listens to you. And then He places His hand on your shoulder. And in that moment, it's as if every anxiety and every fear you've ever had just melts. And you feel a way you've never felt before, and you ask Him, Jesus, why are you sitting here with me, a sinner? And He looks you in the eye and He says, why not you? Why not you? You see, you can. I don't know who you are or where you've been or what you've done. I'm telling you that you can. You can experience the healing of your heart, your sin sickness, just like so many people that Jesus encountered. The man with leprosy, Mary Magdalene, the prostitute who became one of His followers. Even when He hung on the cross, the Roman soldier looking up at Him and professing He was truly the Son of God. Even the thief that was crucified next to Him, right beside Him. Jesus looks at him as He's dying for the sins of the world. He's also dying for this man and says, today you will be with me in paradise. And even Nicodemus, the Pharisee, who was too ashamed to be seen talking to Jesus in the middle of the day, so he goes to Him at night in John chapter 3. And after Jesus was crucified, he was one of the people who helped bury His body. And even Matthew, the tax collector. You see, these people, all of those people had almost nothing in common socially. Nothing in common economically, but they had one thing in common. They all finally came to grips with the fact that their system was not working. That the healing that their soul longed for was only going to be found outside of themselves, not within, but in Christ, the rock. And so my question on this Easter Sunday morning, what about you? For some of you, I know you're skeptical and I understand but I want to ask you, what would it take? Like, what would it take for you to follow Jesus? Would you have to change something about him? Right? Maybe there's something about Jesus himself that you would change and you'd say, okay, if he changed this, I would probably be okay with him. I would follow him. Maybe it's a stance on a particular issue in the Bible. And you're like, well, I just can't get on board with that, right? Or maybe you would change the church. Maybe you've had previous bad church experience. Maybe you would change the demands of being a Christian or the expectations. You would lower them a little bit perhaps, or just change them to suit the system that you've already created. But what is it? And let me just challenge all of us right now, Christian and non-Christian alike. If Jesus really is the Lord of the universe, and if he really did get up and walk out of his own tomb, then we all owe him our allegiance, no matter what else comes along with that. We can learn to deal with the issues and the positions and the stances later. But don't let those things be the roadblock to seeing the beauty of the Savior of the universe himself. If Jesus died for you because he wants to give you a seat at his table, and if on Sunday morning his dead body began to breathe again, and he actually sits up and he stands up and he walks out of his own first century tomb carved into a rock, if he walks out of there, do you understand? Do you understand that no other system matters? No other system that I could dream up in my head or that you could ever live by. Nothing else matters. If Jesus is who he said he is, and if he got up out of his own grave, then we all must bow down and worship him. There is no other option other than rejecting him and losing him. But he gives us himself. He does this for you. You see, you have to let him in and you have to let him wreck you a little bit. You have to let Jesus in your life and you have to let him wreck you. You have to let him challenge you. You have to let him untangle whatever system it is that we've constructed in our minds to think that we can get to God. But here's what you don't have to do. You do not have to clean yourself up before you come to him. You do not have to try to fix yourself before you come to him. To get a seat at Jesus' table, you don't need to pay for a special ticket and you don't have to dress up fancy. You just come. You just come to him with nothing. All you need is need. That's it, nothing. Just the need that you have. You bring that need to him and he'll give you himself because he is everything you need. You see, the other disciples that day, when Jesus walked up to that tax booth, you know they're thinking, why Matthew? Why Matthew, Lord? But Jesus looks at them and says, why not Matthew? And he's looking at you. He's looking at you now. You know what he's saying? Why not you? Why not you? You're the reason I came. I want you to sit with me at my table. I'll reserve a spot for you. Just come to me. Come to me with nothing. Don't clean yourself up. Don't fix yourself up. Just let me do that. You come to me. See me for who I truly am, the risen Savior.